Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows as Ryan Cole climbed the stairs toward his stepbrother's room. It had already been months since he last visited the apartment, and honestly, the entire place still felt slightly unfamiliar despite technically being part of his family now. Ever since their parents got married 2 years earlier, Ryan and his stepbrother Mason Brooks had slowly learned how to exist around each other. At first, things were awkward. Two strangers suddenly expected to act like brothers. But over time, the tension faded into something easier. Late-night gaming sessions, random conversations, sarcastic jokes, and occasional movie nights whenever Ryan stayed over. They weren't extremely close, but they understood each other. And lately, Ryan had started noticing that Mason seemed different somehow. Quieter, more distant. Their parents assumed it was work stress or normal adulthood problems, but Ryan wasn't completely convinced. That was partly why he decided to visit tonight. As Ryan reached the hallway upstairs, he noticed light glowing beneath Mason's bedroom door along with faint sound coming from inside. Probably another movie, he thought. Without thinking much about it, Ryan knocked lightly once before pushing the door open halfway. "Yo, you alive in?" The sentence stopped instantly. Mason nearly jumped out of his chair. His laptop snapped shut so quickly it almost fell sideways off the desk while pure panic crossed his face. "Jesus," Mason muttered sharply. "Ryan." Ryan froze near the doorway, immediately realizing he had accidentally interrupted something private. The awkward silence that followed felt painfully loud. Mason rubbed a hand across the back of his neck while refusing to make eye contact. Ryan looked briefly toward the closed laptop before understanding exactly why Mason looked so horrified. "Oh," Ryan said quietly. Mason looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him alive. "This is not what it looks like." Ryan immediately laughed. "That is literally the worst possible sentence you could say right now." Mason groaned and leaned back his chair dramatically. "Kill me immediately." Ryan laughed harder while stepping fully into the room. "Relax," he said. "You're acting like I caught you committing crimes." Mason still looked embarrassed beyond recovery. "You weren't supposed to walk in. You left the door unlocked." "That's victim blaming." Ryan shook his head, smiling slightly while dropping his backpack near the wall. The tension slowly softened after that. Not completely, but enough for Mason to stop looking completely panicked. His room looked exactly how Ryan remembered it. Slightly messy, clothes tossed across a chair nearby, headphones hanging from the desk, gaming posters covering half the walls. Rain outside reflected softly across the dim room, while warm yellow desk light filled the space. Ryan sat casually on the edge of the bed, while Mason remained awkwardly near the desk. Neither spoke for a few seconds. Then Ryan finally smirked slightly. "So, awkward moment aside, what were you even watching?" Mason immediately pointed at him accusingly. "No, absolutely not. That bad. I'm not discussing this with you." Ryan laughed quietly. Okay. Mason still looked embarrassed, though now he seemed more annoyed than panicked, which honestly felt like progress. Eventually, Ryan leaned back against the wall near the bed. "You know you didn't actually need to freak out, right?" Mason frowned slightly. "Easy for you to say. I'm serious." Ryan shrugged casually. "People watch stuff. It's normal." Mason studied him carefully for a second, almost surprised by how calm Ryan seemed about the situation. "You're weirdly comfortable right now." Ryan smirked. "You're weirdly dramatic. That's because you walked into the worst possible moment of my life." "Trust me," Ryan replied immediately. "That's definitely not true." Mason laughed despite himself. The sound instantly eased the awkwardness further. For the first time since Ryan entered the room, things started feeling normal again, or at least close to normal. Ryan glanced toward the rain-covered window nearby. "Honestly, though, this storm's insane." Mason nodded while finally relaxing back into his chair. "Yeah, power already went out downstairs once earlier." Outside, thunder echoed faintly across the city while rain continued pouring heavily against the glass. The weather somehow made the room feel even more isolated and quiet. Comfortable, almost. Ryan noticed Mason's laptop still closed tightly on the desk and laughed under his breath. "You still look traumatized." "I'm traumatized. You'll survive." Mason narrowed his eyes slightly. "You are enjoying this way too much." Absolutely. Mason grabbed a pillow from nearby and threw it directly at him. Ryan caught it while laughing. There he is, Ryan said. That's the emotionally stable person I know. Shut up. The room filled with easier energy after that. The awkwardness hadn't disappeared completely, but no longer felt unbearable either. Eventually, Mason stood and walked toward the small mini fridge near the corner of the room. You hungry? When am I not? That's concerning. Mason tossed him a soda before grabbing one for himself. The two settled more comfortably afterward. Ryan stretched across the bed, while Mason sat nearby with his laptop still suspiciously closed. After a few minutes, Ryan glanced toward it again. You know, he said casually, you could reopen it now. Mason nearly choked on his drink. Absolutely not. Ryan laughed loudly. What? I'm just saying the situation already happened. No, you're acting like the FBI is involved. Mason pointed at him again. Drop it. Ryan held up his hands dramatically in surrender. Fine. Still, both of them kept laughing afterward. And somewhere during that strange, awkward evening, something between them shifted slightly. Not romantically, not dangerously, just emotionally closer somehow. Because for the first time since becoming stepbrothers, the carefully controlled distance between them had cracked open a little. And sitting there together listening to rainstorm thunder outside the apartment windows, both slowly realized they were far more comfortable around each other than either expected. The rainstorm outside continued long after the awkward moment between Ryan and Mason faded into nervous laughter. Thunder echoed softly across the apartment while yellow city lights reflected through the wet windows of Mason's room. Since their parents were away for the weekend, the apartment felt unusually quiet. For the first time in months, it was only the two of them there. Normally, that would have felt awkward. Tonight, somehow it didn't. Mason sat in his desk chair, while Ryan relaxed across the bed scrolling through random movies on the TV. So your movie choices are still terrible, Mason commented. Ryan looked offended immediately. Excuse me. One of them literally has sharks flying through tornadoes. Ryan pointed proudly at the screen. Cinema. Mason laughed despite himself, and slowly the earlier embarrassment disappeared. The two joked, argued about movies, shared pizza, and spent hours talking while rain tapped softly against the windows. As the night grew quieter, the conversation slowly became more personal. You ever feel weird living between two families? Mason suddenly asked. Ryan understood immediately. Ever since their parents got married, both of them had struggled to adjust to suddenly becoming a family. I thought the whole thing was temporary at first, Ryan admitted quietly. Mason smiled faintly. Same. The honesty between them slowly deepened after that. They talked about loneliness, stress, failed relationships, work problems, and the pressure of pretending life was completely fine. For the first time, Ryan noticed how exhausted Mason actually seemed beneath all his sarcasm and humor. At nearly 2 a.m., the apartment lights suddenly went out. Seriously? Mason groaned. Your haunted apartment finally gave up, Ryan laughed. Mason lit a few candles, and warm shadows filled the room. The atmosphere immediately became softer and calmer. This feels like we accidentally entered an emotional indie movie, Mason joked. Ryan laughed quietly. All we need now is depressing background music. As soft instrumental music played in the background, both of them sat quietly listening to the rain outside. Eventually, Ryan looked toward him and said softly, I'm glad I came over tonight. Mason smiled faintly. Even after emotionally scarring me? Especially after that. The emotional distance between them had almost disappeared now. Not because of the awkward moment earlier, but because for hours they had finally stopped pretending around each other. Mason stared quietly at the candlelight before admitting softly, I think this is the first time in a long time I haven't felt alone in my own head. Ryan looked toward him carefully. You're not alone. For a brief moment, neither looked away. Outside, the storm finally faded into silence, but inside Mason's room, neither of them seemed ready for the night to end. Morning arrived slowly over the mountains. Soft sunlight filtered through the thin walls of the tent, while distant birds echoed through the forest outside. The cold night air had faded, replaced by the calm warmth of early morning spreading across the campsite beside the lake. For a few quiet seconds, everything felt peaceful. Then reality returned. Ethan opened his eyes slowly, memories from the night before rushing back almost instantly. The emotional conversation, Noah's confession, the closeness between them that had changed everything. His chest tightened immediately. Beside him, Noah was already awake, sitting quietly near the tent entrance, looking out toward the lake. Something about his expression felt different now, more distant. Ethan sat up carefully beneath the blankets. "Morning." Noah glanced back briefly before giving a small nod. "Morning." The awkwardness in his voice appeared immediately, and Ethan noticed it instantly. The silence between them no longer felt warm and comforting like last night. Now it felt uncertain, fragile. Neither seemed fully sure how to act around each other anymore. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face while trying to calm the nervousness building in his chest. Everything had felt so honest in the darkness last night, so real. But daylight somehow made emotions feel more complicated. Noah unzipped the tent halfway, letting cool morning air drift inside. "I'm gonna make coffee." "Okay." That single word was all Ethan managed to say before Noah stepped outside. The second he disappeared, Ethan leaned back against the blankets and closed his eyes briefly. Fear slowly settled inside him now. Not fear of his feelings anymore. Fear of losing Noah completely. Because suddenly every possibility felt dangerous. If things between them failed, their friendship could collapse too. And Ethan honestly didn't know who he would be without Noah in his life. Outside, he could hear Noah moving around near the campfire pit while water heated over the small camping stove. Normally mornings between them felt effortless. Constant jokes, teasing, easy conversation. Today the silence felt heavy instead. When Ethan finally stepped outside the tent a few minutes later, the atmosphere around the campsite already felt different. Noah stood beside the fire holding 2 coffee mugs while staring quietly at the lake. The mountains reflected beautifully across the water beneath the bright morning sky. But neither of them seemed able to fully enjoy the view now. Ethan walked closer slowly. "Thanks." Noah handed him one of the mugs carefully. Their fingers brushed briefly. Both immediately noticed it, and both looked away afterward. That hurt more than Ethan expected. For a while they sat quietly beside the fire sipping coffee while birds moved through the trees overhead. Finally Noah spoke. "So," Ethan looked toward him. Noah stared down into his mug before continuing quietly. "Last night was a lot." Ethan's chest tightened. "Yeah," he admitted softly. Another silence followed. Noah rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I barely slept." "Me neither." The tension between them kept growing stronger the longer they avoided saying what they were both truly thinking. Eventually Noah sighed quietly. "I don't know what happens now." The honesty in his voice felt painfully vulnerable. Ethan looked toward the forest briefly before answering. "I don't either." And that was the truth. Because neither of them had planned for this. For years their friendship had existed inside safe boundaries neither dared cross. Now those boundaries were gone, and suddenly the future between them felt terrifyingly uncertain. The rest of the morning passed awkwardly. They packed supplies for a hiking trail deeper into the mountains, but even normal conversations felt harder now. Every small moment carried emotional weight behind it. Every glance felt too meaningful. At one point Noah nearly dropped the backpack while distracted, and Ethan instinctively reached out to steady him. The brief touch froze both of them instantly. Noah pulled away first. Not harshly, just nervously, and Ethan felt disappointment settle heavily inside his chest. The hike through the forest started quietly. Tall pine trees surrounded the narrow trail, while sunlight filtered softly through the branches overhead. Normally Noah would have spent the entire hike joking nonstop. Today he stayed mostly quiet. Ethan kept noticing him drifting into his own thoughts while walking ahead. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes of silence, Ethan spoke carefully. "Are you regretting this?" Noah stopped walking immediately. The question hung heavily between them. "What?" Noah asked softly. Ethan looked down briefly before continuing. "Everything from last night." Noah stared at him for several seconds before answering honestly. No. The answer came quickly enough to sound real. But something still felt wrong. Then why are you acting like this? Ethan asked quietly. Noah exhaled sharply before running a hand through his hair in frustration. Because I'm trying to understand what this means. The emotion in his voice surprised Ethan slightly. Noah rarely sounded overwhelmed. But now confusion and fear were written clearly across his face. We've been best friends for years, Noah continued quietly. And suddenly one conversation changes everything. Ethan stepped closer slowly. Maybe it doesn't have to ruin anything. You don't know that. The sentence came out sharper than Noah intended. Instantly regret crossed his face afterward. But the damage was already done. Ethan looked away toward the trees, hurt settling visibly in his expression now. Noah sighed heavily. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Noah struggled to answer immediately. Because deep down, he wasn't afraid of Ethan. He was afraid of how much Ethan mattered to him now. I'm scared, Noah admitted finally. The honesty softened Ethan's frustration instantly. Noah looked exhausted emotionally as he continued speaking. I spent years thinking our friendship was the safest thing in my life. He laughed weakly under his breath. Now suddenly I'm terrified of losing it. Ethan felt the same fear every second since sunrise. But hearing Noah say it out loud somehow made it more real. They continued, walking quietly until eventually reaching the lake deeper inside the forest. The water shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight, while mountains surrounded the area completely. Usually the view would have amazed them both. Today the emotional tension between them overshadowed everything else. Night settled quietly across the apartment. Outside the windows, the city glowed beneath soft streetlights, while distant traffic moved through rain-soaked roads below. The storm from the previous night had disappeared completely now, leaving behind calm silence that somehow made the apartment feel even more emotional. Ryan sat alone on the living room couch, staring absently at the muted television screen, while Mason remained in the kitchen nearby. The tension from earlier still lingered between them. Not anger, not resentment, just emotional exhaustion. Both had spent the entire day trying to understand feelings neither expected to become this complicated. For a while, the apartment stayed completely silent except for the soft sound of dishes being washed in the sink. Then, finally, Mason walked back into the living room, carrying 2 cups of coffee again. You drink way too much caffeine, Ryan muttered quietly. Mason gave a faint, tired smile. Emotionally difficult conversations require survival methods. Ryan accepted the coffee, while Mason sat down across from him. Neither spoke immediately. The warm yellow lamp beside the couch cast soft shadows across the room, while city lights reflected faintly against the windows nearby. Finally, Mason exhaled quietly. I've been thinking all day. Ryan looked toward him carefully. That sounds dangerous. Mason laughed weakly under his breath. Then his expression softened again. I meant what I said earlier, he admitted quietly. I don't want us to become strangers after this. Ryan's chest tightened slightly, hearing the vulnerability in his voice. Because deep down, that fear had been haunting him too. Mason leaned back against the couch slowly before continuing. For years I felt like this family situation was something I just had to survive. He looked down briefly. But somewhere along the way, you actually became important to me. The honesty in the sentence settled heavily between them. Ryan stayed quiet for a moment before answering softly. You became important to me too. Mason smiled faintly, though emotion still lingered visibly in his eyes now. The distance between them slowly began softening again. Not because their problems disappeared, because they finally stopped pretending those emotions didn't exist. Ryan looked toward the dark apartment windows before speaking carefully. I think we spent most of today panicking because we were trying to force ourselves into some clear answer. Mason frowned slightly. What do you mean? Maybe we don't have to define everything immediately. Mason considered that quietly. Ryan continued softer this time. Last night mattered because it was honest. That doesn't suddenly become wrong just because things feel complicated now. The words visibly affected Mason, because deep down, He already knew Ryan was right. Their emotional connection hadn't appeared overnight. It had been slowly growing for years through trust, loneliness, comfort, and understanding. The only difference now was that neither of them could ignore it anymore. Mason rubbed his hands together thoughtfully before admitting, "I think I'm less scared of feelings," he paused briefly, "and more scared of consequences." Ryan nodded slightly. "That's normal. Our parents would never understand any of this." Ryan stayed quiet because, honestly, he wasn't sure they would either. Family expectations suddenly felt very heavy now. But at the same time, pretending their emotional bond didn't exist anymore felt impossible too. Mason sighed quietly. "I hate that everything has to feel so complicated." Ryan looked over at him carefully. "Maybe it only feels complicated because we actually care." The room fell silent again after that. But this silence felt calmer than before, more honest. Mason stared down into his coffee cup before speaking softly. "You know what scared me most this morning?" Ryan shook his head slightly. "For a few hours, I thought we ruined everything between us." The vulnerability in his voice made something ache inside Ryan's chest, because he had felt the exact same fear. Ryan leaned back against the couch slowly. "I don't think honesty ruins relationships," he said quietly. "I think hiding from honesty does." Mason looked toward him for several seconds without speaking. Then finally he laughed softly under his breath. "You always randomly become wise during emotional disasters." Ryan smirked slightly. "It's a talent." That small moment of humor eased the heaviness between them even further. For the first time since morning, the apartment no longer felt emotionally suffocating. Mason stood after a while and walked toward the large living room window overlooking the city. Ryan joined him a few moments later. Below them, cars moved slowly through glowing wet streets while thousands of apartment lights stretched endlessly into the distance. The city looked peaceful from up here. Mason crossed his arms quietly while staring outside. "I think part of me spent years feeling alone even when surrounded by people." Ryan glanced toward him carefully. Mason smiled weakly. "And then somehow you became the one person I could actually relax around." The sentence affected Ryan more deeply than he expected, because despite all the confusion, fear, and emotional tension between them now, one truth still remained painfully clear. They genuinely understood each other. Ryan leaned lightly against the window beside him. "You don't have to figure your entire life out tonight." Mason laughed softly. "Good, because I definitely can't." Ryan smiled slightly too. After a moment, Mason spoke again. "So what happens now?" Ryan thought quietly before answering honestly. "I think we stop trying to panic about the future." He shrugged slightly. "And maybe just focus on not losing what matters." Mason looked toward him carefully. "And what matters?" Ryan held his gaze this time. "You." The silence afterward felt emotional in the softest possible way. Not dramatic, not reckless, just real. Mason looked away briefly, visibly overwhelmed by the sincerity in Ryan's voice. Then, after a few seconds, he smiled softly to himself. "You know," he admitted quietly, "this is probably the most emotionally honest conversation I've ever had." Ryan laughed under his breath. "Same." The tension between them finally began fading completely after that. Not because every problem suddenly disappeared, but because they chose understanding over fear, honesty over avoidance, and most importantly, because neither wanted to lose the connection they had built together.